In this video, you're going to learn about Mary Midgley's famous paper, Trying Out One's New Sword. You'll learn how she argues against cultural relativism and argues ultimately that moral isolationism, the idea that cultures are just in individual silos, is problematic. Welcome to the Philosophical Life. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing to the channel, clicking the bell so you don't miss any future videos. And if you'd like to go deeper in ethics, then I highly recommend you check out the guide on the trolley problem. In this guide, you'll learn how to best present the trolley problem so that you can go deeper in your discussion of ethics. You can get right down to moral theory and especially some of the key moral principles like the doctrine of double effect. So go ahead and download that guide. It's free for you at trolleyology.com, and I'll provide a link to that in the description below. Now, let's jump into the slides. Mary Midgley was a philosophy professor at Newcastle University in England, and she wrote this famous paper as part of a chapter in her book, Heart and Mind. Now, as you can see here, the initial idea that she's targeting is what's called moral isolationism. Moral isolationism you can think of as a form of cultural relativism. So cultural relativism is the theory that correct moral standards are always relative to a particular culture. So in essence, ultimately, culture, what a culture accepts or approves, determines what's right or wrong. And she notices that presupposes or implies what's called moral isolationism. What is that? Well, each culture, you might say, is in an individual silo. A silo, as you may know, is something that stores grain, and each silo is just sort of a self-contained unit. Now, moral isolationism says that when it comes to morality, each culture is sort of on its own. And as it says in the slide, it denies that we can ever understand another culture except our own well enough to make judgments about it. So if you're in a particular culture, if you're in a silo, you can't look at another silo, at another culture, and have enough information about the background norms, the history, everything that sort of goes into making up a culture and an accepted practice in that culture, and then actually make a judgment about it. Now, respect and tolerance, so being a respectful person toward another culture, requires that you don't make those judgments. It requires you don't sort of adopt a stance that's critical and standing over that culture, because that presupposes that you know better or you understand that culture well enough to actually make a judgment about it. And as Midgley says, moral judgment, the judgment that something's right or wrong or morally good or bad, is a kind of coinage. It's a sort of a currency that's really only valid within the particular country of origin. So this is the position that Mary Midgley is setting out to target. Now, you might wonder, well, what sort of practices are we talking about? What she targets is in ancient Japan, there was this practice, or she imagines there's this practice. There's a little dispute about whether it actually went on as she says it, but we can just imagine as a hypothetical case, if it's not real from history, though there is some context for it. And what it is it's the Japanese term Tsujikiri. So Tsujikiri literally means crossroads cut. So what is that? Well, a samurai would get a new sword, a new katana, and would need to test it. So if a samurai is to be a good samurai and not bring shame on his family and to represent his family well, then when the time comes for him to go into battle or to take out an enemy, that samurai needs to be able to, with one blow, slice the person basically from shoulder to flank, basically slice the person in half. Pretty brutal, I know. So there was this practice. Well, when you get a new katana, if you're going to know whether the sword can actually do that, you have to test it out. So this verb in classical Japanese means, as it says, to try out one's new sword on a chance wayfarer. So somebody's chilling, walking along, in ancient Japan, and then out pops a samurai, whoo, just slices them in two, or tries to see if the sword is any good. You got to actually test it out. Because if it was to work properly, it basically, as I said, had to just go from shoulder to the opposite flank, whoosh, and then tests were needed. And so these wayfarers, these walker-bys, passerbys, unsuspecting victims, needed to be expended in order to know that the sword was worthy and wouldn't bring shame upon the samurai warrior were that warrior to go into battle with it. What are your initial thoughts about that practice? I mean, does that seem okay, morally speaking? Well, Mary Midgley is having the intuition that you'll think, wow, that is a brutal practice. It seems just morally wrong. But wait, I'm in a particular culture, in a particular time, sort of looking back at that practice. How can I make that judgment that what that samurai did was morally wrong? If cultural relativism is true, then I can't make that judgment. What was true of ancient Japan in terms of accepted practice of the samurai warrior may not apply to, and I may not be able to understand it, to the modern world we live in today. And especially the culture that I live in that doesn't have samurais walking around, and it's generally not okay to just go around harming people in that way, although people do, unfortunately, but it's morally wrong. We can make that judgment. So what this view does is it isolates judgments to a particular culture and time, and you can't actually make these judgments that intuitively you should be able to make. You should be able to look back and say, no, that's really morally wrong. Or if a particular culture accepted slavery and practiced it, I can still look back and make the moral judgment that's morally wrong, even if within that culture it was a morally accepted practice and standard. Now Professor Midgely makes the claim, well, wait a minute. Does this isolating barrier work both ways? So remember, we're looking at the silo, and if we, in our particular silo, can't look at another silo, another culture, and make a moral judgment about that culture's practices, then what about that culture making a judgment about us? That is, that silo looking to us and the stuff we do, which there's a lot of reprehensible stuff in our culture, morally wrong, but can another culture come in and judge us? The barrier doesn't work both ways. Like, what she means is we think it's okay for another culture to come in and shed new light on what we're doing. We may not like it. We may think it's wrong. But if something we're doing is truly violating the rights of others, harming the humanity in others, not respecting them, treating a class of people in a way that is biased and stereotypical and racist and so on, if we're doing that, and we've just been doing it because it's part of our culture, then it's okay for another culture to come in and make a judgment. Sure, they may not understand our cultural context to its full because they haven't lived it, but we need that outside perspective because we get blinded when we're in our silo. We can get blinded to the morality of the things we're doing and how they may be immoral, and we need to adjust and make moral progress. So this idea of moral isolationism doesn't work from outsiders, like delivering perfectly good indictments on us. And she gives an example of a practice where a particular outsider came into another culture and right away diagnosed that culture, what the problems were with it, made a super laser clear diagnosis, and then left. And then is it the case that that person can't make that judgment, or that judgment's not valid? In some sense, you might say it's more valid, as I mentioned, because they come in with fresh eyes, with a fresh perspective. Additionally, as you well know, probably from traveling or just learning about other cultures, understanding of a culture can come in degrees. And it's not like, well, you're in your silo and you can't make a judgment about us that's legitimate on our practices. So because you don't understand it, you don't understand us. And it's like, well, no, you can come to understand us to a certain degree, and intelligent outsiders can progress in that understanding. So moral isolationism just is all or nothing. It's just, sorry, you can't make a judgment about us that's legit on our moral practices. And But what Midgley points out is, no, that's not the case. Understanding is a degreed notion. It's not all or nothing, and we can progress. And outsiders can come in, learn a little bit, make a judgment, and that judgment can be accurate. Now, next, Midgley says, look, it does this. She wonders, well, does this idea that other cultures can't blame us or pass negative moral evaluations of our practices also bleed over into praise? Like, what if we're making moral progress? What if we're doing some good stuff in terms of celebrating the rights of individuals and particular groups, and we're honoring people's dignity and their rights and their humanity? What if we're doing that? Can another culture come in and praise us for that? Or is it truly the case that even judgments of praise are totally isolated, and all cultural relativism holds across the board, and there's no way for other cultures to sort of praise other cultures? Well, to respect people, here's the key: we have to know enough about them to make a favorable judgment. So you can't respect another culture if you don't understand it. Now, what the tricky thing here that Midgley points out is that typically the proponent of cultural relativism thinks that, well, we're being respectful to another culture, because who am I to pass a judgment? That's hubris. That's arrogance. That's cultural sort of, some thing of the past where we thought one particular culture was dominant over another. No, that's not necessarily the case. Why? Well, to respect another culture, if you're going to say you show respect by not judging because, another culture's practices are unintelligible to you, she says, well, no, actually, to respect people, you have to know enough about them to make a favorable judgment. So as it says, our praise would be worthless if it rested on no definite grounds, if it didn't flow from some understanding. The moral isolationist can't ground her isolationism in both of lack of understanding and respect. So the moral isolationist wants to say, look, my isolationism is based on the fact that we can't understand other cultures, and because of that, we're being respectful by not passing moral judgments. And if we do, they're legit and not valid. They're illegitimate and not valid. Well, actually, part of respecting another culture is coming to understand them and to understand their practices. And if you're going to praise another culture, you have to actually understand them in order to praise them. So you can't ground your isolationism on respect, because you're not respecting another culture if you're not even seeking to understand them. If you're like, well, their cultural practices are completely unintelligible, I won't even make an effort, I won't, pass a judgment because I can't, who am I? That's not actually necessarily showing them respect. Respect would be leaning in. Respect would be pursuing that culture, reading about it, going there, meeting the people, staying in the homes of the people who live there, listening to them, learning from them. That's respect. And then you can make a judgment. You're not just limited. You can praise them. And that praise is warranted, especially on the basis of understanding. And that is a form of respect. So moral isolationism can't have its cake and eat it too, namely, be based on a lack of understanding and respect. Now, what is involved in judging? So judging, we've been throwing around that term, it's just basically to form an opinion. Now, if we can't judge other cultures, here's the last kicker. Can we really judge our own? So I live in the United States. At some point during the civil rights movement, people started to wake up to the racist practices and biases built into the system and so on. And they realized, hey, this is morally wrong. And they took a stand, like Martin Luther King Jr. and many others. And if we can't judge other cultures and judgment's just a matter of forming an opinion, then how can we even form moral judgments about our own culture? Right? So moral isolationism wants you to be able to do that because you're in the culture. So you can pass judgments about your own culture, at least in theories. But wait, the same mechanism that you would use to judge other cultures, which moral isolationism says you can't, is the same mechanism you'd use to judge your own culture. So, as it says in the slide, our efforts to do so would be much damaged if we're really deprived of our opinions about other societies. Why? Well, because they basically provide a contrast case. They provide it like something else to look at and say, how is our culture measuring up? And if I'm going to be able to pass a judgment about this culture, then it helps to actually look at other cultures and see what they're doing and compare it to our own. And that is this spectrum of alternatives against which we set what we want to understand. And moral isolationism would lay down, as she says, a general ban on moral reasoning. So moral reasoning involves comparison. It involves consideration. It involves reaching an opinion, a conclusion. And if, again, that you can't use that mechanism, you're banned from judging another silo, another culture. How are you going to use that effectively on your own culture, especially given that you need to look at other cultures as a contrast case or a comparison to see how your culture is measuring up or failing? And she says the process of moral reasoning is going to involve taking those things into effect. After all, if you just look at your own culture and form an opinion about it, you might say, well, everything's going great. Or if you're in that culture and you're a dissenter about some of the moral practices, then if moral isolationism is true, how would you have a legitimate thing to contrast with what your current culture is doing? You'd say, well, the way our culture is treating minority groups is wrong, for instance. Well, look at this culture. Look at how they treat people of different backgrounds and ethnicities and races. They treat them all equally with respect and fairness in all these different areas. Well, you can't make that judgment if you can't make a judgment about another culture legitimately, right? So we would be hampered in our moral reasoning, our ability to reach moral conclusions about our own culture were moral isolationism true. But moral reasoning is just one of the important factors that we need to keep progressing morally as a culture. And that's another reason to cast doubt on moral isolationism and cultural relativism. So I would love to hear some of your thoughts. Here are a few questions I'd love for you to respond to in the comments. Are those opposed to our judging other cultures equally opposed to other cultures judging ours? Do those who live in a culture necessarily understand it better than those who don't live in that culture? And then lastly, if criticisms of other cultures are always inappropriate, can praise of other cultures ever be appropriate? What do you think? I've laid out Midgley's case. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And also remember to download that free ethics guide on the trolley problem, 3 Secrets of the Trolley Problem, and it is at trolleyology.com. We'll see you next time. Keep thinking ethically and living wisely. Keep living the philosophical life.